evening, everybody. My name is Dr. Kathy Scottmeyer, and I have to read my notes because I forget who I am most of the time. My name is Dr. Kathy Scottmeyer, and I'm a professor of psychology. I'm also the director of the School of Social Sciences, which is where the psychology program is housed. It's my pleasure to welcome you here this evening to this year's Jim Klee Forum Lecture Series. This is a signature event here at UWG, and it's, home. Its home is in the psychology program. This annual lecture brings together our undergraduate students, our graduate students, our alumni, our faculty, and our community to celebrate the spirit and the inquiry of innovation that Jim Klee embodied throughout his career. Jim Klee was born in 1916 and passed away in 1996. He was not just a professor, but he was a pioneer, a seeker, a boundary breaker in the fields of humanistic and transpersonal psychology. In 1971, he joined the faculty here at the University of West Georgia and helped to shape it into one of the nation's leading centers for humanistic and transpersonal studies. He was a colleague of Abraham Maslow at Brandeis University, and Klee influenced the development of cognitive psychology and inspired generations of students to think beyond traditional boundaries. For Jim, psychology was not just about theories, it was about exploration, transformation, and understanding the interconnectedness of all human beings. His writings included Points of Departure, Aspects of the Tao, and essays like The Absolute and the Relative, Omniscience, Time, and Suchness. And these reflect his lifelong passion for seeking insight at the intersection of science, philosophy, and spirituality. To honor his legacy, the Jim Klee Forum was established in 1987, bringing distinguished scholars and innovative thinkers to our university. Over the years, we've welcomed luminaries such as Houston Smith, Clark, can't say that name, Mustakas, Jean Houston, Robert Ramachan, and Stanley Krippner, all of whom in their own ways have expanded the horizons of psychology and human consciousness. Tonight, we're going to continue that tradition, and we are thrilled to have our speaker with us who also pushes the boundaries and challenges conventional thinking, just as Jim Klee would have encouraged. But before we introduce our distinguished speaker, I'd like to invite you to consider supporting the University of West Georgia's Psychology Fund. Your donations, of course, help to sustain programs like this, provide opportunities for our students, and support groundbreaking research in humanistic and transpersonal psychology. If you'd like to contribute, please visit, if you're going to go online, it's westga.edu/give. Be sure that when you use the drop-down menu that you click other and then type in psychology fund. That's what it's called. If you are a boomer like me, you can also mail your donation in. Just make sure that you're for the psychology. So without further ado, I'd like to turn this over to Dr. Talia Werner, who is going to introduce tonight's speaker.
Do we know if is it okay to stand here for the Zoom, or is it better to go back? Okay, you can see me. Yeah. Cool. Well, thank you all so much for coming. This is really great, and I'm very excited to introduce Dr. Rebecca Lester from Washington University in St. Louis. Dr. Lester is a medical and psychological anthropologist with a research focus on embodiment, intersubjectivity, and cultural practices of self-cultivation. She is primarily interested in how people understand and experience existential distress, the institutions and practices that arise to address this distress, and what these experiences, institutions, and practices can tell us about local moral, phenomenological, and epistemological worlds. Dr. Lester's work to date has taken the form of several intellectual projects, each of which has grappled with different aspects of several core themes. So her earliest work on eating disorders and asceticism examined disciplines of asceticism such as fasting, celibacy, deprivation of comfort, as culturally elaborated practices for negotiating gendered conceptions of morality. She focused on anorexia nervosa as a contemporary ascetic practice, interrogating the cultural dimensions of this condition as one in which particular moralized forms of body ritual assume center stage. That early work was the foundation for a research project concerning young women in training to become nuns in a Roman Catholic convent in Mexico and their experiences of religious vocation. The study examined the ways the sisters' existential transformation proceeded in direct, everyday engagement with larger cultural concerns about Mexican nationalism and cultural identity in the face of an accelerating movement into the first world. This research is the basis for Dr. Lester's first book, which is titled Jesus in Our Wombs, Embodying Modernity in a Mexican Convent. Over the past 25 years, Dr. Lester has ongoing engagement in critical medical anthropological work concerning eating disorders as syndromes that both manifest and challenge dominant cultural notions of gender, agency, and moral personhood. She has been particularly interested in how models of eating disorders enfold and prescribe certain kinds of gendered subjectivity as healthy while excluding or pathologizing others. Dr. Lester's work in this area engages questions of how the body figures into or disappears from operating ideological explanations of these conditions, how quote unquote healthy agency is implicitly gendered in dominant models and techniques of recovery, and how presumptions about the correct female sexual body informs understandings of eating disorders and the interventions used to treat them. One of Dr. Lester's current projects, which we'll be hearing about tonight, is entitled Love American Style, Polyamory, Consensual Non-Monogamy, and Transformations of Intimacy Under Late Capitalism. This project inquires into ethical self-fashioning, affect, and materiality in a new, though related direction, sort of building off of the previous work, exploring a burgeoning relationship form in the United States, polyamory or consensual non-monogamy. Although consensual non-monogamy has been part of the underground American relationship landscape for decades, it has recently exploded into the mainstream stage, becoming what some characterize as the new sexual revolution. So in trying to understand why consensual non-monogamy and why now, this new research explores how and why people become involved in consensual non-monogamy, what kinds of everyday self and emotion work are required regarding issues of jealousy, for example, and how the daily practices of consensual non-monogamy are experienced as an ethical self-project among practitioners, and how this trend articulates with broader cultural and economic shifts in the US. Across all of these work, we find certain cross-cutting themes in Dr. Lester's research. At the sort of level of the individual or subjective, Dr. Lester asks, how do people make sense of the world through their bodies? And how is this ongoing process of embodiment intimately and inextricably relational? On what we might describe as the social level, Dr. Lester asks, how do people engage bodily practices to help them navigate misfits between their own experiences and cultural prescriptives? And on what we might broadly be called the cultural level, Lester asks, how do institutional structures condition such bodily practices either as technologies of those institutions or as domains of resistance, or in some case both? Across all these levels, Dr. Lester is interested in how interpersonal, institutional, and social structures and dynamics of power and inequality inform the possibilities and limits of being. Dr. Lester is currently writing a book about dissociative identity disorders that draws on both her clinical and anthropological expertise to explore new ways of thinking about the self. The title of this forthcoming book is Coming Undone: Dissociative Identity Disorder, Self-Making, and the Politics of Truth in the Virtual Age. And all of these are topics that in the discussion and also in an event that I'm about to describe tomorrow, Dr. Lester would be happy to discuss. So I wanted to invite everyone, particularly students, to join us tomorrow in Melson at 11:30 a.m. for a more informal seminar or conversation with Dr. Lester, after which we will be going somewhere local for lunch. So please join us for that if you're interested, and thank you all for coming tonight.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for the invitation to come and for the very warm reception that I've received here. It's a lovely campus and community, so I've really enjoyed my time here, and thank you for that wonderful introduction. I appreciate it. So I'm going to be talking from notes, so I'm going to pretty much stand here. Talks about 50 minutes, so just to give you a little framework for it. But a few words before I begin. Non-mainstream genders and sexualities have always been subject to violence and erasure. We are currently in an era where these risks are amplified. I'm mindful of this and giving this talk. To protect the confidentiality and safety of the people that I interviewed, all names used are pseudonyms and all identifying information has been changed. So I want to make sure that I know how to change my slide when necessary. We'll wait till I change the slide. We'll find out. Yeah. Yes, I'll do that. Okay, so here we go. The first time her husband went on a date with another woman, Kelly felt sick to her stomach. Overwhelmed with anxiety, she threw up twice and cried for 3 hours straight until he came home. The second time he had a date night, this time with a different woman, Kelly sat on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, hate watching 90 Day Fiancé and eating ice cream until she heard his car in the driveway. By the fifth time, she didn't feel like waiting up for him and went to bed early. By the eighth time, Kelly met her husband out for drinks after his date, and then they went home and had the best sex of their lives. Kelly, a trial attorney, is no shrinking violet, silently enduring her husband's wandering eye. Nor is her husband, Tim, an IT manager, an entitled husband who expects his wife to hold down the fort while he goes out to play. Kelly has her own dates with other men, a fact that Jim rejoices in. Yes. There's nothing like that feeling when Kelly comes home from a date and she's soaring and giddy because it went so well, he told me. And I'm like, that's amazing, babe. I'm so happy for you. And I truly am. It brings me so much joy. I love seeing her in love. Kelly and Tim practice polyamory. They form deep, meaningful, romantic relationships with more than one person at a time, with the full knowledge and consent of everyone involved. This is a far cry from the traditional monogamous ideal, which has long been the bedrock of American society and culture. Monogamy is the quintessential family value that binds the nuclear family together. Yet over the past decade, polyamory has stepped into the spotlight as the fastest growing sexual practice in the United States. And people are talking about it. From dozens of articles on sites like Medium and features and outlets ranging from Teen Vogue to The Atlantic, to reality TV shows and plot lines and network dramas and reality shows, polyamory is well on its way to becoming mainstream. NPR, Scientific American, and Newsweek have all characterized the rise in polyamory as the new sexual revolution. In a society built on the bedrock of heterosexual monogamous marriage and the centrality of the nuclear family, polyamory's rise is more than just a curiosity. It seems that something tectonic is shifting in how many Americans think about, practice, and experience sexual and emotional intimacy. I'm an anthropologist and a licensed therapist interested in how people navigate intimacy and relationships and what this can tell us about broader cultural transformations. Over the past 9 years, I've spent quite a bit of time researching polyamory the way anthropologists do, by spending time with people in different kinds of settings and circumstances, getting to know them well, learning how they view themselves in the world, observing what they do, and asking lots and lots of questions. I've done a deep dive of field research into this subculture, talking to over 80 people who identify as polyamorous about their experiences, motivations, aspirations, regrets, and lessons learned. What I found has been both unexpected and enlightening. For the purposes of this talk, I'm going to focus on one aspect of polyamory, the experience and management of romantic jealousy, that captures some of what is unique about this practice and why it may be increasing in popularity. Specifically, I argue that working with and through experiences of jealousy in polyamory becomes a site of ethical self-work that aligns emotional, relational, and political priorities in ways that become profoundly embodied. So there are three key components to my argument that I'll be talking about today. So first, polyamory is inextricable from critiques of monogamy, capitalism, and settler colonialism. And it envisions an alternative to social contracts based on ownership. Participating in polyamory, then, is not just about relationship preferences, but is, by design, a form of political and ethical action. Second, in polyamory, jealousy is understood to be a legacy of these problematic structures, where relationships are about ownership and control. Polyamorous people are not immune to jealousy. They feel it just like everyone else. What's different about polyamory is that working through jealousy becomes a key part of a larger ethical practice. And third, the importance of this ethical self-work in polyamory helps illuminate broader cultural transformations that may account for its current flourishing. So I want to be clear before I get too deep into this, that I do not myself identify as polyamorous. I've been in polyamorous and other ethically non-monogamous relationships in the past, and I had positive experiences with them, but I identify as monogamous and I'm happily partnered. I am not then an apologist for polyamory, monogamy, or any particular form of relating, as long as all participants are adults who freely consent. What prompted me to do this work is the profound public misunderstandings of polyamory that have been circulating in the wake of its rise in popularity, and the missed opportunities this creates for better understanding human intimacy and flourishing. So, I first became interested in polyamory in 2016. Newly single at the time, I re-entered the dating scene, and like most people these days, I signed up for several dating apps, like Bumble, Tinder, Facebook dating, and so forth. And I soon noticed something really striking. Again and again, I encountered profiles where people listed their relation status as polyamorous or in an open relationship, accompanied by lengthy narratives explaining what this meant, often with links to partners' profiles to assure prospective dates that their partners actually were fully aware of their activities. I found this fascinating. Not so much for the fact that people had unconventional relationships, I've had a few of my own, but because it was being telegraphed so plainly, as though it's just another relationship status on par with looking for casual dating or interested in a long-term relationship. This was definitely a change from the last time I'd been single. I became intrigued by what seemed to be a fundamental shift in the dating landscape, and I wanted to understand it. So to do so, I had to think carefully about how to ethically proceed in conducting research in this arena. It was essential that I be transparent about my interest in doing research with people who identify as polyamorous. Yet this did not seem to be an appropriate thing to put in my dating profile. So I changed my strategy. I was still explicit in my profile that I was looking for a long-term relationship. But if I came across someone who mentioned in their profile that they were non-monogamous, I would swipe right. If we matched, I immediately messaged them to explain that I was not interested in a non-monogamous situation at the moment, but I'm an anthropologist doing research in this area, and I wondered if they'd be willing to talk to me. Every single person said yes, enthusiastically, absolutely they would. And their partners were often interested in sharing experiences as well. Many also offered to put me in touch with other people they knew who might be interested in participating. In addition to the people I met this way through apps, I also made posts to my personal Facebook, Twitter, Instagram accounts announcing that I'm conducting this research and inviting anyone interested in speaking with me to reach out. This led to several interviews and further contacts with people in the community whom I also interviewed. I also attended 3 national polyamory conferences and several local events where I met and conducted interviews with additional participants and people not at the events to whom they referred me. So using the snowball sampling approach, I interviewed basically anyone willing to speak to me who was above 18 years of age, identified as polyamorous, and was capable of giving informed consent. Several of the interviews were formal, They were recorded interviews either by Zoom or in person, but others were informal interviews or conversations where recording wasn't possible, after which I took detailed notes. All participants were assured of confidentiality, informed about the scope of the study and the potential risks involved, and were informed they could withdraw from participation at any time. My positionality as a white, female identifying heteroflexible academic with personal experience with polyamory surely influenced people's willingness to speak with me in the ways they presented themselves in their experiences. Although I did not volunteer anything about my own experiences with polyamory, if people asked, I was honest that I've been involved in a few poly relationships in the past and am currently in a monogamous relationship. So to date, I've talked to approximately 80 people who identify as polyamorous. Reflective of the poly community at large, most were in their 30s or 40s and middle to upper middle class. About 70% identified as white, 20% as Latinx, 5% as Black, and 5% as bi or multiracial. Most identified as either men or women, with about 5% identifying as non-binary. About 40% identified as heterosexual, 30% as bisexual, and 30% as gay or lesbian. Participants were from all areas of the United States and came from all walks of life. Bankers, DJs, nurses, corporate executives, genetic scientists, military personnel, academics, truck drivers, housewives, and businesswomen, to name just a few. I've spoken to people just at the beginning, just beginning to consider opening up their relationship, those who were new to polyamory, those in polyamorous partnerships that had never been monogamous, those who had been polyamorous for many years, others who tried polyamory and decided it wasn't for them. I've talked to people who practice solo polyamory, kitchen table polyamory, non-hierarchical polyamory, and relationship anarchy. And I've also spent countless hours engaging with polyamory blogs, Facebook groups, Instagram and Reddit posts, and discussion boards where people seek out connection, information, and support. Okay. Some cultural misperceptions of polyamory. In a recent article in The Atlantic, Tyler Austin Harper, an assistant professor of environmental studies at Bates College, outlined his view on what is happening with polyamory in America. The title of the piece, Polyamory, the Ruling Class's Latest Fad, signals Harper's main point. Polyamory, he says, is, quote, little more than yet another way for the ruling class to have their cake and eat it too. Harper characterizes polyamory as a fad enjoyed by young elite hedonists seeking justification for indiscriminate sex by wrapping it in a philosophy of self-fulfillment and independence. Polyamory, he says, is emblematic of the, quote, banal pleasure-seeking of the wealthy elite culture in the 2020s. Worse than this, he argues, this culture would have us believe that the interminable self-improvement projects, navel-gazing, and sexual peccadillos are the new face of progress. Harper's view of polyamory, according to my research, is wrong on several accounts. In basic terms, in terms of demographics, research shows that although people who engage in polyamory do tend to be more highly educated than their monogamous counterparts, they are more likely than monogamous individuals to earn less than $40,000 a year. They are not then the privileged chattering class that Harper describes. They are regular folks. They have jobs and children. They run carpool and pay rent and go to the grocery store and watch the news. They come to polyamory through a variety of avenues and for a range of reasons. Where Harper most misses the mark, though, is in assuming that polyamory is primarily about having sex with multiple partners or escaping the hard work of commitment. Polyamory, I've learned, is about intimacy, not sex, and it has ethics at its core. Boundaries, self-responsibility, and respect for others' autonomy are key principles. The goal is to ensure that everyone involved in a given situation has freely consented to the arrangement and is treating each other with consideration and respect. So this explicit focus on ethics derives from how different polyamory is from traditional monogamy. Reality TV shows like The Bachelor, Love is Blind, Say Yes to the Dress, and others are popular for a reason. They tap into a cultural narrative about true love and monogamy that undergirds our entire society. The story's familiar. Someday when we find them, our one true love will complete us. They will be our best friend, lover, intellectual partner, and emotional support system all rolled into one. When we find that person, we will feel blissfully fulfilled. If we are not fulfilled, according to this narrative, then there's either something wrong with our partner, they aren't the right person after all, with the relationship, toxic dynamics have derailed the fairy tale, or with us, our needs are unrealistic or too big. The solution then is to fix our partner, the relationship, or ourselves. So polyamory emphasizes that it is the idea of monogamy itself that creates and sustains these issues. One person cannot possibly meet all of our needs. The very premise is faulty and sets everyone up for failure. These unmet needs are then either denied, turned into resentment, or lead to infidelity involving lying and deceit. In polyamory, monogamy's faulty premise of the singular right love is put front and center. It's like this, Chris, a 37-year-old real estate agent told me. We have groups of friends, right? Maybe you go out dancing on the weekends with one, another one is the person you call when you've had a horrible day. Maybe someone else is a sports fan, so you go to the ball games together. That's totally normal, right? We don't expect one friend to be our only friend because we have different kinds of relationships with different people. It's unrealistic to expect one person to do it all. So love, polyamory practitioners say, is similar. Like friendship, it is not a limited resource, but it is additive. More love begets more love. When you have multiple kids, you don't love one of them less just because another one is born, John, a 36-year-old business analyst, explained. There's enough love for all of them. You love them each for who they are uniquely. Polyamory then is not about superficial or immediate pleasure seeking, as Harper contends. It's about building loving, honest, mutually fulfilling relationships with more than one person in order to meet these different needs. Those connections might include sex, but they might not. They might involve commitments that last months, years, or even a lifetime. These distinctions are more than merely semantic. They reveal polyamory as a relationship practice that is radically different from what many people envision. Far from being a trendy fad for the sexually hedonistic liberal elite, then, polyamory is a complex ethical practice that demands a great deal from those who practice it. What this suggests is that the current flourishing of polyamory is not just a curiosity or a random event. It indexes something important about our current cultural moment and how people experience and value intimacy and relationships. So of course, polyamory is not new. It's been around for a very long time. The roots of contemporary American polyamory extend back through centuries of countercultural and revolutionary initiatives, from 19th century transcendentalism to the Oneida community to the commune movements of the 1960s and 70s that centered on critiques of the family, monogamy, and private property. Contemporary polyamory continues this anti-capitalist stance. For example, Kim Tallbear, an anthropologist with a popular critical non-monogamy blog, argues that monogamy is emblematic of relationship forms tied to settler colonialism, economic extraction, and ownership. It is these structures that polyamory seeks to destabilize. Tallbear says, within open monogamy, I push for analyses that help us envision ways of relating beyond such normative agreements and also beyond Western notions of romantic love, conditioned, whether we know it or not, by capitalism's coercive power. As part of this critique, many practitioners of polyamory highlight the scarcity mindset of monogamy under capitalism. As Wilkinson notes, monogamy, exclusivity, and possession can be seen as a way in which to uphold the competition and anxiety on which capitalism resides. So poly folks instead advocate for an approach to relating that is abundance-oriented, where love is an infinite resource and love for one person is not diminished by love for another. Accordingly, according to Wilkinson, a rejection of mononormativity could be a way in which to expand the potential for spaces of encounter, to be open to new loves, new intimacies, new affects, and new ways of relating to the world. This new abundance mindset is often challenging for newcomers to polyamory to integrate because it's so at odds with our cultural narratives about true love and romance, and requires a whole-scale unlearning of how one orients to intimacy. People cannot just flip a switch and turn off the cultural messaging about monogamy or change the emotional responses they have developed over a lifetime of living within a mononormative culture. An abundance mindset for romantic love must be cultivated over time through deliberate self-work aimed at counteracting ingrained messages about monogamy. This self-work is not easy and can generate intense emotions. Jumping into a non-monogamous relationship style can bring old pain and anxiety screaming to the surface, author Lola Phoenix notes. Because polyamory can evoke issues around attachment, abandonment, and loss, feeling intense anxiety is part and parcel of the practice. Much of the daily work of polyamory, in fact, has to do with managing these kinds of feelings. In this sense, polyamory is what we might call a lifestyle politics, where intimate practices are tied to larger commitments about social transformation. Many poly folks understand living a polyamorous lifestyle as a radical act, actively destabilizing the traditional economic and family structures that underpin contemporary American society and cultivating new forms of sociality. I do this because I want to change the world. Annika, a 52-year-old white woman who heads a national nonprofit, told me. We live in such a dominance-oriented society. Everyone is out for themselves. And there's a scarcity mindset. Like if you get something, that means there's less for me, so I better beat you to it and then keep it for myself. Polyamory is different. We operate from a mindset of abundance, egalitarianism, and community. We envision a different kind of society. I look at it like this. You can change laws and you can change policies, but to really move the needle, you need to change families. When you change families, that's what will bring about real cultural change. We can't do anything about Russia or the divisiveness in our country, but we can do something about our own relating, said Marley. She was raised in a polyamorous household. She's been married for 10 years to a man who was raised monogamous, and they were slowly inching their way towards polyamory. But she notes, all of this means resetting your values, and it's hard. All right, so now I'm going to talk about jealousy and polyamory, and I love this post. Y'all got to kill the idea that polyamorous means you've transcended jealousy. You will still feel jealous. That's normal. Feel your feelings. Learn how to communicate in a healthy way. Unlearn the idea that love means possession. And this is from a Reddit thread. Since opening our relationship, I've been struggling hard with anxiety attacks around feelings of jealousy. No matter how much I try and logic my way out of it, I have felt pretty intense anxiety attacks a few times while he's out with other people. These anxiety attacks are not sustainable. I've tried journaling it out, stewing on it, figuring out what's at the root. It's all very hard to disentangle. My anxiety is such a physical force in my body, and I find myself fixating on the jealousy and working myself into a full body panic for hours. I would appreciate any advice people have in terms of managing anxiety attacks, working through jealousy, etc. So despite its increasing popularity, polyamory is still a difficult practice for many people to wrap their heads around, particularly when it comes to this issue of jealousy. Indeed, author Lola Phoenix, who I cited before, describes jealousy as polyamory's scarlet letter. It is, they note, the first question most monogamous people ask when they tell people they're polyamorous. Don't you get jealous? Jealousy is often the first thing people mention to me when they learn I'm researching polyamory as well. Oh, I could never do that, Evelyn, a 38-year-old Black lab technician, told me. I wouldn't be able to deal with the jealousy. Your partner going on dates with someone else? Oh, hell no. James, a 44-year-old white business analyst, had a similar view. I don't think I'm secure enough for that. I would always be obsessing about what my partner was doing with other people and whether she was more fulfilled by them. No way. So importantly, people who practice polyamory share these concerns. They are no more immune to jealousy or insecurity than anyone else. I never thought I'd be able to do this, said Bethany, a school teacher who about opening her marriage 5 years ago. Never, and it was brutal in the beginning. He'd be out on a date and I'd just be at home curled up in the bed, sobbing. I was terrified I was making a huge mistake and he was going to leave. But then he'd come home after a date and tell me about it. And it wasn't so scary. And he was coming home to me. That's part of what's so powerful about poly. In some ways, your worst fear comes true. Your partner is romantically interested in someone else. But you see that that doesn't have to take anything away from what the two of you share, that your connection can survive and even get stronger for it. Carrollton, a 38-year-old artist, agreed. Jealousy is the worst, he said. It's a really difficult emotion. I used to feel it constantly in the beginning, and I still get twinges of it at times, even after 12 years. Now, though, I know that jealousy is about me, not my partner. When I feel jealous, I ask myself, why am I feeling this right now about this situation? What's going on with me that I'm feeling the need to cling to him or control what he's doing? It's an opportunity to learn more about myself and to keep working on my stuff. Polyamory practitioners like Bethany and Carrollton have not found some magic solution to get rid of jealousy or insecurity. They struggle with it regularly. In fact, managing jealousy is part and parcel of everyday polyamory practice. Repeatedly participating in situations that produce jealousy, like watching your partner go on dates and build relationships with other people, is not just a byproduct of polyamory, but in many ways defines it as an ethical and relational practice. In polyamory, romantic jealousy, as I've noted, is seen to derive from the scarcity model at the core of monogamy that holds that romantic love is finite. The more you give to someone else, the less there is for me. The practice of polyamory challenges people to reorient to the abundance model of romantic love, where love for another person is additive rather than subtractive. Under this view, jealousy becomes obsolete. Nothing's being taken away, so there's nothing to be jealous about. This is a difficult transition for many people to make, and it can take years of daily emotional labor to overcome the cultural programming about monogamy and scarcity. Polyamory seeks to denaturalize jealousy and to decouple the feeling of romantic jealousy from the responses to that feeling. Successfully living a polyamorous lifestyle doesn't mean getting over jealousy. It means reorienting one's relationship to jealousy. Coming to understand that it is not simply an instinctive or so-called natural reaction to a perceived threat to romantic attachment, but is indicative of monogamy's deep grip on our bodies and minds. Polyamorous individuals learn to become hyper-attuned to jealousy as the crux of a lifestyle politics that operates on multiple levels at once, from the intrapsychic to the corporeal, to the interpersonal, to the political. Understanding when and how jealousy shows up, recognizing what it looks and feels like, determining what it is and is not, who is responsible for managing it and how, and discerning what it signals about a given situation and the individuals involved are all critical skills to becoming successfully polyamorous. By dismantling the rationale for jealousy, the aim is to interrupt the links between jealousy and the culturally patterned responses to it. In this way, jealousy's provocation and management in polyamory function as everyday micro-laboratories for configuring affect, sociality, politics, and intimacy, and dialogue with broader structures of value. Jealousy emerges as a kind of ethical barometer in polyamory through which people make sense of their own internal worlds and identify areas for further self-work. It serves a heuristic function that allows practitioners to continually craft and tinker with an ethical self through the provocation and curation of affect. Jealousy then is not something to be avoided in polyamory, but is seen as an opportunity for continued growth, both personally and politically. Experiencing, recognizing, talking about, and working through jealousy in polyamory enables people to refashion ethical selves in their intimate everyday lives, bringing the anxieties about capitalism, consumerism, and individualism into conversation with the intimacies of attachment and desire. Okay, I've already said this, but I'm going to say it again. Polyamory surfaces these latent assumptions about scarcity, calls upon practitioners to deliberately curate a new ethical self oriented toward freedom and abundance, in contrast to anxiety as the affective grammar of scarcity typical of late capitalism. So in short, polyamorous folks don't do what they do because they don't feel jealous. They do what they do in part because, at least in the beginning, they do feel it. And they are deliberately working to undo the cultural logics and orientations that enable it. This is not an easy task. Working through these complex issues is not a one and done sort of thing. Rather, managing jealousy is an ongoing, everyday, unfolding ethos of being and relating that's informed by the broader ethics of polyamory practice. So working with and through jealousy. So however much one may be committed to an ideology or a set of ethical principles, real life can get messy. And successful polyamory requires a kind of relating and forms of communication that Julie, a 34-year-old ICU nurse, referred to as relating on steroids. Because not only am I attending to this one person and making sure our marriage is healthy, I also have other people in my life who have their own needs and expectations, and we have our own relationships. Being poly really requires an enormous amount of honest communication and compassion to navigate. And you have to be extremely self-aware and honest with yourself about your own feelings and needs, or else you won't do it well, and someone could get really hurt. Renee, a 48-year-old white woman who's been practicing polyamory for the past 30 years, agreed. She said, you can go on autopilot with monogamy, not with polyamory. Polyamory will blow up if you do that. In other words, the successful practice of polyamory requires openness, empathy, self-awareness, and humility, coupled with this ongoing willingness to evolve. We're a heart-centered people, Renee continued. We like growth. So this idea of relating on steroids means recognizing, identifying, and working through the anxieties that can arise in polyamory, but without giving them free rein and letting them drive reactions and interactions. This can be transformative. As Brian, a 33-year-old white man, noted, dealing with jealousy has probably been the best learning experience of my life. It can be a great teacher. The question you have to continually ask yourself when you feel jealous is, what is this telling me? How can I use this to challenge my received assumptions about love and relating? Ideally, then, the self and emotion work around jealousy progressively reorients the self away from the ethics of scarcity, ownership, and clinging, and toward the ethics of abundance, non-possessiveness, and release. But as I've said, making these shifts is hard work. It requires continual effort and attention to assure that all relationships are handled ethically and with care. And the everyday practice of polyamory, as you might imagine, is fraught with risks, challenges, and deeply felt anxieties about what can go wrong. Partnerships can implode. Agreements can fall apart. People can get hurt. The emotional stakes are high. The following set of posts on a public online polyamory forum illustrates what this kind of self-work can look like in practice and how jealousy emerges as a key site of intervention. So, jealousy, does it ever end? Or is polyamory not for me? This poster says, my boyfriend has been seeing another girl, let's call her B, for a little while now, but the majority of their relationship took place while I was exchanged in another country. It was hard hearing about them together when I was away, and the green-eyed monster was definitely lurking here and there. Now I'm back in the same country as them, and last night I encouraged my boyfriend to meet up with B because he hadn't seen her since I arrived a couple weeks ago. I felt awful. Honestly, last night for me was effing terrible. Even when I fell asleep, I'd dream about her or me and her or him and her. It was like there was no escape. This morning we spoke briefly and he mentioned that they slept together. At no point did I say that wasn't okay, so I have no reason to feel the way that I do, but I had no idea it would hurt this badly. Right now I'm torn between needing to see him right now, this second, to talk it out, or never seeing him again and calling the whole thing off. The idea of him with other girls hurts me in a way I haven't ever experienced before. I know that it's some parts jealousy, but there is no anger or betrayal involved, just a deep resonating pain. Is this normal? Does it get better? Or am I just not cut out for polyamory? The responses to this post were varied, with some commiserating and saying that they were never able to get past the jealousy and they left the polyamory lifestyle. Most, however, naturalized the poster's feelings as part of the process of entering polyamory. You've never really experienced this before. And the first time we experience a powerful emotion, we have no tools for dealing with it. We have to build coping mechanisms. Are you a parent, or have you ever spent time around little kids? Watch them when they are first experiencing things like anger and frustration. They have no tools for dealing with it, and they completely break down and fall to the floor and have a fit. That's where you are with jealousy. You don't have the tools to deal with it. But like that child, you can build a set of tools for dealing with this emotion, but you're going to have to work on it. You're going to have to experience it and come to understand it and find healthy ways to express it and cope with it and eventually find ways to accept it. Once you've done all that, you can move past it. Others encouraged the poster to examine what was underneath their jealousy to see what it could teach them. I have found that jealousy, a completely valid feeling, by the way, is most often a symptom of fear. What that fear is different from person to person. Once you recognize the triggering fear, you can judge yourself for it if it's a valid fear or not, and work on it if necessary, either alone or with your partner, depending on what's needed. Just remember, there's nothing wrong with feeling jealous. But if you want to reduce the amount that you feel it, find the root cause and work on that. Also, feel your emotions. They are a part of you. There are no bad emotions. You just need to choose how to react to them. Someone else said, I would ask you to take some time to think on your feelings. While you claim you are feeling jealousy, and I'm by no means attempting to invalidate that feeling, or some form of that, my question to you is, have you stayed in your feelings long enough to figure out why? I used to get jealous thinking about partners with other partners. I used to wonder what they were getting that I couldn't provide, inadequacy. I used to feel like it was part of their life that I wasn't allowed to be involved in. I used to feel like it somehow distracted from what I had with them when they got something elsewhere. Over time, I learned to stay in those feelings in the moment instead of pushing them down. And being able to do so, I learned that a lot of times feelings weren't necessarily jealousy, but other things like envy or fear or fear of missing out. Instead of feeling inadequate, I found that the lack of some sort of concrete bond between my partner and myself, as you have, say, a monogamous marriage, made the bond that does exist even more meaningful to me. It is a bond there that is there entirely and without question because both parties want it to be there, as opposed to feeling obligated or mandated to do so by societal norms. So in these posts, we can see the kind of intensive self-work that is involved in polyamory, especially in the beginning. And we can see how the degree to which one feels jealousy and how one responds to it is thought to indicate something about one's emotional development toward the ideals of polyamory. The implication is that unexamined jealousy and polyamory are incompatible. Jealousy without introspection or a willingness to work through the underlying issues will cause things to fall apart. This is consistent with what I learned in my interviews. Arti, for example, a 29-year-old South Asian woman, was going through a divorce at the time of our interview. She said, my husband and I had been poly for several years with no problems. But then he started dating this new woman who had only been in monogamous relationships. This was her first poly situation. She really had a hard time wrapping her head around it all. I felt a lot of empathy for her, so I bent over backwards to try to make her feel comfortable. And things were okay, but not great. Then when the pandemic hit, we decided we'd all move in together. Him and her, me and my girlfriend, the four of us. Boy, was that a mistake. It seemed like the more I tried to accommodate her jealousy and anxiety, the worse things got. Finally, she told my husband she was moving out and he could either come with her or not. That's when he told me he wanted a divorce and he moved out with her. So here Arti cites her husband's girlfriend's jealousy as the core difficulty in their dynamic and as the ultimate catalyst for things falling apart. She suggests that these feelings were associated with the girlfriend's monogamous experiences and her inability to make the shift to a polyamorous mindset. Arti was adamant that it was this, not polyamory itself, that was the cause of the breakup. It had nothing to do with being poly, she said. Monogamous marriages end in divorce all the time. And no one says, aha, it's because of monogamy. In our case, his girlfriend just couldn't make the shift. So we can see here how polyamorous people emphasize the importance of this continual critical self-reflection around issues of anxiety and jealousy and this ongoing working through of those feelings as essential to successful polyamory. This is seen to be absolutely central in making the shift and successfully living polyamory day to day. Okay, scaling up. As I noted, however, polyamory is more than just an individual sexual and intimate practice. It's a philosophy of relating that both cultivates and requires a shift in practitioners' entire worldviews in ways that have deliberate and explicit political implications. This is the core of what makes polyamory, as Olivia Goldhill calls it, the most quietly revolutionary political weapon in the United States, and that it radically reimagines the nature of social connection. She says, today's polyamorous may not be rejecting conventional jobs or bourgeois consumption, she notes, but they are shifting fundamental structures of society simply by relating to each other differently. In a time of political polarization, challenges to reproductive rights, protracted economic instability, and alarming global conflict, many polyamorous folks talk about their intimate practices as actively challenging mainstream worldviews and working to build a different kind of society. Specifically, polyamory aims to challenge the centrifugal forces that perpetuate alienation and separation and the capitalist logics that animate the links between the nuclear family structure and private property ownership. By moving from that scarcity to abundance mindset, many polyamorous people understand what they're doing is actively challenging these worldviews and working to build a different kind of society. Okay. Well, many practitioners of polyamory understand what they're doing, as I said, is challenging these fundamental structures of capitalism. The everyday practice of polyamory is grounded in deeply neoliberal understandings of self and agency. And poly is in many ways a quintessentially neoliberal practice. So this is one of the interesting tensions that emerges. Most mainstream literature about polyamory is written in a self-help style, emphasizing the importance of knowing, understanding, and taking charge of oneself and mobilizing that knowledge and understanding toward a goal of self-fulfillment and self-realization. They have titles like the Polyamory Toolkit, the Smart Girl's Guide to Polyamory, I'm Not Jealous, the Polyamory Handbook, and the Anxious Person's Guide to Polyamory. Workbooks like the Jealousy Workbook, Exercises and Guides for Managing Open Relationships, and Polyamory Journal, a relationship book, Prompts and Practices for Navigating Non-Monogamy, offer exercises for practicing the skills necessary for successful ethical non-monogamy like polyamory. The path to self-realization, according to this literature, is a rejection of the received structures of intimacy and relating, and the pursuit of highly individualized designer relationships, tailored to the particular needs and desires of those involved in a given situation. As Jenny, a 29-year-old professor, told me, monogamy assumes that we'll fall in love with our soulmate and will be completely fulfilled by one person. But that's just not realistic. It puts an enormous amount of pressure on the relationship and on your partner. When they inevitably can't meet every need because no one person can, we tend to either blame them for not being enough or blame ourselves for needing too much, instead of looking at the structure of monogamy itself as a problem. The whole premise sets people up for failure. Kirby, a 32-year-old white business owner, agreed with this. He said, I find it amusing the way that people say polyamory is a recipe for disaster. Actually, it's the other way around. Structures of monogamy have caused far more problems for people. Expectations of monogamy are at heart about economics and control, not romance. Once we started to think of monogamy as an imperative of love, that's when things got messed up. It's a recipe for disaster because it's built on completely erroneous understandings of how humans work. So successful polyamory necessitates cultivating what Blocking calls an entrepreneurial self, capable of actively seeking out different relationships that meet recognized needs and then managing them as a functioning system. This quintessentially neoliberal orientation is resonant with broader social and economic trends typical of late capitalism, like the shift to gig work, where workers position themselves as free agents, patching together different gig jobs to make an idiosyncratic, self-tailored whole. Similarly, in polyamory, maintaining different relationships that meet different needs is thought to have a better chance of leading to overall satisfaction than relying on just one partner. In this way, the management of jealousy in polyamory is resonant with the happiness industry described by Sarah Ahmed, which transforms the anticipatory worry of anxiety into a different kind of futuristic orientation, where to pin hopes on the future is to imagine happiness is what lies ahead of us. Ahmed's theory of happiness rests on the idea that it involves the pursuit of something that is always just out of reach. It is, as Watson notes, a capitalist response to the shared public secret that everyone is anxious. Future happiness becomes a moral guideline for how to live in the present. In this way, as Ahmed says, the promise of future happiness is tied to the endless labor of resisting anxiety in the present. And this obsession with future happiness overshadows the anxiety produced in its wake. The pursuit of future happiness, both individual and societal, alchemizes anxieties like jealousy into not only a moral guideline for living, but also an ethical orientation to relating to others and to one's own effective life. The contemporary flourishing of polyamory can be read as an outgrowth of this happiness turn that Ahmed describes. By marking the points of intersection between the personal and the political and positioning actors in relation to a variety of ethical commitments, jealousy in polyamory works as both an expression of conditions of precarity, material, ideological, emotional, and as a sort of fuel for the continued pursuit of a future happiness, where the labor of managing jealousy transforms not only forms of relating, but the subject herself. The question is whether that subject is truly the anti-capitalist, anti-hegemonic one that practitioners of polyamory envision, or whether it's perhaps instead the fullest expression of 21st century America's most palpable anxieties. We'll talk about anxious America's world of worry. This exploration of jealousy and polyamory illustrates how affects can work across multiple domains, from the individual to the political. By retooling one's experiences of and reactions to jealousy and polyamory, it becomes what Nye calls a subject determining orientation that defines the subject through which it becomes manifest. In other words, it's not just a cultural structure of feeling, nor is it solely a private emotional experience. Jealousy constitutes those through whom it circulates and within whom it resides in relationship to broader understandings about agency, ethics, and social responsibility. Experiencing, recognizing, talking about, and working through these kinds of anxieties in polyamory enables people to refashion ethical selves in their intimate everyday lives, bringing anxieties about capitalism, consumerism, and individualism into conversation with the intimacies of attachment and desire. Now, anxiety's work as a barometer of well-being is not unique to people who practice polyamory. In fact, it structures the current cultural moment in the United States. Anxiety in 21st century America is what Dwekovich calls a public feeling, that is an ethos or vibe that dominates and organizes social life. 24-hour news cycles stoke fears about minorities, immigrants, and political others. Active shooter drills are a regular routine for school children. Cops are called on people jogging, bird watching, or even sleeping while Black. Doom scrolling has become a national pastime. Rates of anxiety have skyrocketed over the past decade with a massive threefold increase in the wake of the COVID pandemic. All of these are signs of a nation palpably vibrating with anxiety. America was once characterized as Prozac nation. Today, we have become what Williams calls the United States of Xanax. But more than this, in recent years, the United States has moved from the age of anxiety to the age of anxiety about anxiety. One doesn't have to look very far to find a deluge of books, podcasts, blogs, newscasts, and articles ringing the alarm bells about the epidemic of anxiety gripping American society. Older generations are anxious about the failing safety net. Millennials are anxious about climate change, economic collapse, and political instability. High school students are anxious about the ever-narrowing possibility of being able to afford higher education and job markets that offer little promise. Elementary school kids are simply anxious. Situate all of this within a world of sped-up information sharing and panopticon-like surveillance, and it generates what Shapira calls anxiety culture. Whether or not we are truly more anxious now than people were in the past, it is clear that anxiety about our levels of anxiety has become a defining ethos of our current age. It is a moment in which how one manages anxiety becomes a focus of increased attention as a critical skill for navigating the pressure cooker of modern life. So I suggest that the everyday practice of contemporary polyamory is emblematic of this broader cultural worry about anxiety. It's a lifestyle of politics where an anxiety like jealousy is transformed from something troubling or oppressive into something constructive and instrumental for continued growth. It can enable a sense of agency and mastery in a world that for many feels increasingly out of control. Better understanding how anxiety works to build worlds in polyamory, as well as the kinds of strategies people can engage in to amplify or derail those worlds, contributes to our understanding of affects as a generative arena of anthropological inquiry that can also productively be engaged as part of a wider collective project of resistance. So to conclude, I feel compelled to address the question of why any of this matters, especially right now, as our democracy is under serious threat and the structures that keep our society functioning are under active attack. It seems to many that the very fabric of America is fraying right before our eyes. So why spend so much time and energy talking about something like polyamory when there are so many other critical pressing issues that need attention? So here's what I say to that. It has become increasingly evident over the past few weeks that business as usual no longer applies. We cannot rely on the social contracts we thought were so solidly in place. Now more than ever, we need to envision new ways of caring for and with each other that are not bound to the systems of governance that are either being dismantled or used against us. Now more than ever, we need to find more expansive ways to engage with one another that center on openness, communication, trust, and respect. Whether or not polyamory makes sense for any of you personally, it has much to teach all of us about how everyday practices of loving one another can have the power to transform not only ourselves, but society more broadly. Is that a pie in the sky utopian vision? Perhaps, but it is also a vision for how something both as simple and as complex as love can become a way of moving the mountain one pebble at a time. Thank you. Thank you.
So we were going to start by opening it up for questions and discussion here in the room, and then maybe have some questions come up in the chat, and then maybe turn to some of those.
Do you think that polyamory is possible without like a sense of compersion, like the happiness for other people's happiness, or do you think that's like the bedrock, like the foundation of it? Like people who you said their relationship didn't work, like with her husband, because he met somebody and she was getting jealous and stuff like that. That jealousy needs to be substituted with the happiness for other people's happiness. Like you see your husband come back from a date and that makes you happy because he's happy.
Yeah.
Instead of jealous because she might have something you don't.
Right. Yeah, there's discussions about this within the community about how necessary compersion. So compersion is taking joy in somebody else's joy. So people have different opinions about how necessary that is. And some people say it is, other people say it might be a goal, but not everybody gets there, and that's fine. You can find ways to still engage in polyamory without feeling that like rush of joy for your partner when they have a great date. So I don't think it's necessary. It seems to help, but it's not necessary. Yeah.
So excuse me, I'm losing my voice.
Oh no.
So I have a couple close buddies who practice polyamory themselves, but they had much different experience than a lot of how you have kind of talked about it. Like, you know, a lot of these pictures make it look very, you know, it's like in those commercials for the medicine where everyone's frolicking around.
Yeah.
But really, they're talking about like, you know, this may cause heart attacks and blah, blah, blah. It's like,
right.
you know, there's the,
right.
you know, the ups and the downs. So
Yeah.
these friends of mine that I'm talking about, they went to engage in polyamory, but it turned into more of a cuckold situation.
Okay.
And something that I found interesting, that the man who was in fact the cuckold in this, he felt as if he deserved it, or as if it was like almost like a way of he was harming himself. It was like he was channeling this energy, like you said.
Right.
It was really interesting.
Yeah.
I just wanted to see what your thoughts on that was, the channeling the energy, but not necessarily to be something more productive, but counterproductive.
Right. Yeah, that could absolutely happen. It happens in monogamous relationships as well, right? You know, any relationship can be kind of mobilized in these ways that can be self-harming or other harming. So yeah, that is a challenge. And it's one of the reasons that people in the poly community emphasize the importance of continuing to do your own self-worth, understanding why you're engaging in this practice, how you feel about it, what you're doing with it. You know, I don't know if his partner was aware that he was feeling that way. I don't know, but But yeah, I mean, that's a risk
Yep.
with any kind of relating with
So,
other humans,
he
right?
Made it very clear, as a matter of fact, he was indulging.
Okay,
He was insisting that she embraced that feeling.
interesting.
Yeah, I just thought that was really interesting dynamic.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it is when you have multiplication of partners, there's a multiplication of things that can develop, right? And so all the more reason why the communication is so critical and the ethics and the boundary piece. But yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, back there. Oh, sorry. Don't know who was first, but
I can go. In your presentation, when you were showing the responses of people, I noticed that there is a concern about pleasure and pain in the relationship.
Mhm.
And it feels to be a central theme for polyamory practitioners.
Mhm.
So I'm thinking about this theme in terms of science and definitions that psychologists use to describe romantic relationships.
Mhm.
So is there a theory why people create or need intimacy?
why they need intimacy?
Yes. Why they need intimate relationship?
That's a very interesting question. So I come from an anthropological perspective, so not so much from the psychology. So I'd love to hear from psychologists in the room about this. Seems to be a pretty inborn human need to have intimacy. For the most part, there are people who don't, right? And you know, that's fine. But for the most part, it seems to be a pretty inborn thing that we need. Now, what that means is going to be really different depending on what culture you're in, what subculture you're in, all that sort of thing. So I don't know if the psychologist would have any particular theories about why people need intimacy, but seems to be pretty common. Yeah. Yes.
Thank you for this presentation. It's courageous, yeah.
Thank you.
Especially at this time. I found your kind of last part really interesting in light of the individualistic values of poly in America. And I understand most of your sample was white. Is that the case?
No, well, most, yes.
Yeah.
It was mixed, but yes, I would say, the
No,
majority
I
were.
was reflecting on the kind of communal aspects of polyamory.
Mm.
I was wondering if you could speak to that, you know, people's relationships with their metamors, their
Yes.
partners, your community building. And I also say that having grown up as a South Asian American in a joint family,
Mhm.
right, where I was raised by, you know, my mother, my father, and two aunts. And I think for the first 3 years of my life, I wasn't actually, my body was not sure who was my mother.
Right,
You know?
right.
But that was really helpful for survival as an immigrant family. It was not just a dyad, it was kind of a community.
That's right.
Communal raising of children. And so did that come up at all in the interviews?
Yeah, it definitely did. And there were some people who, you know, definitely talked about the importance of that. Now, not everybody has arrangements where they're in touch with their metamors, their partners or whatever, but a lot of people do. And especially with raising children, that came up a lot, and also with economic hardships, that if you are pooling resources with more people, it's, you know, easier than if you're going it alone or just with one other person. And it's interesting that you mentioned about coming from a South Asian immigrant family. A woman that I just talked to last week is a physician, and she had traveled with Doctors Without Borders all around the world. And she saw all these different family structures of people who live with extended family or who live with, you know, in a closer community. And this was a big impetus for her about getting involved in polyamory, because she saw that as a really different way of living than our kind of like parceled out, you know, couples that we do here for the most part. Yeah, thank you.
There are a couple of questions from the chat. Maybe we can just talk to some of them. So the first one is, did you interview anybody who said they didn't experience jealousy at all, negatively? And were they different in other ways?
Nobody has said they've never felt jealousy. Some people talked about it as more of a struggle than others, but I have never talked to anybody who said, oh yeah, jealousy just never ever an issue for me. No, not the people I talked to.
Okay. So yeah, thank you again. I really enjoyed that. And I keep thinking about the section at the end also about, you know, this paradox of of polyamory being a pushback against certain, capitalist structures and also a embodiment of it, and this, entrepreneurial, polyamorous, neoliberal self. And so I'm wondering, especially in the scenarios where it's not everybody all living together, in the part where before that, or if it never gets there, I can see the reworking of love as an abundant resource instead of a scarce one, but what about time as a resource?
Yeah. That people talk about that a lot. They will often say love is infinite, time is not. And that is where a lot of frictions do come, because there really is, there's only 24 hours a day. You can only be one place at a time. And so a lot of negotiations that people have, a lot of relationship agreements that they develop are really around that. And when there's friction, often it's more about how much time they're spending with someone else versus you, or whatever. Yeah, so that is an ongoing thing. There's a couple of apps that people use to organize, or people use Google Calendar with different calendars. They come up with all sorts of strategies. It's especially challenging if there are children involved and people have to get to soccer practice or whatever. So they come up with a bunch of different strategies to try to manage that. But that is, I would say, one of the key challenges that people face. Yeah.
You again, Dr. Lester, for coming. I just had a question in reference to couples who may start off as a monogamous couple, and then the idea of polyamory is introduced. Do you see any implications that they may have for a difference in agreement, like both partners kind of come on, but one may have initiated the conversation, and acceptance of the lifestyle, and how that may have some differences in the levels of jealousy? Did you see any of that?
Yes, absolutely. So one couple that I talked to, they're a married couple, and it was the wife who raised the issue of wanting to open the marriage, and it's actually frequently the women. I think people assume it's going to be the man in a couple that wants to open the relationship, but it's often the women. And so she was all about it, and her husband was like, I don't know about that, but I'll try. So she goes, and like it's often easier for women on the dating scene. So she's like out dating, and he's struggling to find people to go out with. But he did kind of force himself to go out, but he was just like, I'm monogamous. I'm not enjoying this. This is not what I want. And so it was a challenge for them, because it was this imbalance. He, agreed that she should do what she needs to do, but it was hard for him. And then in other cases, one person wants to open up, the other person's not sure about it. So they spend a lot of time reading, going to conferences, talking to people, and they may take like a year or two or more before they actually take that step. So they try to wait until they're both really on the same page. Yeah.
I was fairly curious. The earliest exposure that I think a lot of people kind of get to polyamory or open relationships, etc., tends to be through representations of older generations, swinging.
Yeah.
I was curious why, if you have any knowledge or take on why it tends to be those older generations that, before the supposed sexual revolution, etc., why that was a more acceptable sort of group thing that occurred versus now, where there's still a lot of discourse and debates and contention regarding it, but not so much on this almost stably accepted thing that goes on.
Yeah, I think in previous generations, there was much less awareness and flexibility around alternative relationship styles, right? So I think the idea of trying to openly have a polyamorous dynamic would be very difficult. But, if you go to a party and you do some swinging, or there's, whatever's going on there, it's easier to kind of keep it on the down low. So I think that's part of it. Because when you have a full-blown relationship with someone, you don't just do that for a night or two. It's ongoing, so it's harder to kind of keep under wraps. So I think it's just with greater openness to, well, until recently, greater openness to, accepting these alternative forms that has allowed this to emerge now. Yeah.
Hi, I just wanted to ask your opinion on most people that I've talked to who are like actively averse to polyamory come at it from an angle specifically talking about like more into like older polyamory, not to necessarily more modern ones, but coming at it from the angle that it like promotes patriarchy or like it stems from patriarchy. And I wanted to like ask what your opinion on that like viewpoint would be.
Right. So they may be conflating polyamory with polygamy, which are two different things. But even so, there is a concern, and this is something people in the community talk about a lot, is that, you know, like anything else, it's situated within a cultural setting where patriarchy is the name of the game, right? So there can be elements of that. So, but that's part of what people discuss is the kind of ethical core. So there's something, for example, that is a big ethical no-no. It's called the one penis policy. And that's where a guy has multiple girlfriends and says, oh, sure, you can have lots of other connections as long as they're women. So that's a big no-no for exactly that reason, because it's replicating this kind of patriarchal structure. So it's something that, you know, does show up. People talk about it a lot, but it is different from polygamy, where there is specifically one man and multiple women, and they don't have outside relationships. Yes.
So it seemed like one of the main things about polyamory, like a lot of reasons why people turn to it is like one person's not meeting their needs. And a lot of people were saying stuff like, how can you possibly ask one person to meet your needs and things like that? And I'm pretty sure this gentleman right here said something about intimacy and love and needing it and stuff like that. And I couldn't help but think about Abraham Maslow's like hierarchy of needs. And one of the things he was talking about was like, you need like food, all that other stuff, yada, yada, yada. But one of the things was love and intimacy. And I was like, I think love and intimacy, if you look at like the hierarchy, love and intimacy is the only thing you can't get on your own.
That's
so
right.
The only thing that you really need from your partner is love and intimacy, right? So isn't it problematic to look for other needs in a partner? Like all you need is love and intimacy. You don't need all that other stuff. So wouldn't monogamy be better if you don't need too much?
Well, I can say what my interlocutors would say, which is love and intimacy are big categories, right? And can mean lots of different things. And there's different kinds of love and there's different kinds of intimacy. And so like the love I have for my children is different than the love I have for my partner. Like, you know, these kinds of things. So, so if somebody is oriented in a polyamorous way, then they would probably say, yeah, I get love and intimacy from this person, but that doesn't fill all my buckets for that. Like there's still other kinds and it's going to be unique with each relationship that I have. So that's
certain needs that's impossible to get on your own. Like you can't really get intimacy and love. Well, you can love yourself, but not that
right.
kind.
Yeah.
So it's like, since there's different types, you need somebody else to show it to you. And that's kind of where polyamory comes into play sometimes.
Yeah. Or you experience yourself differently also in different relationships. So there's that piece also.
People kind of.
Yep. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Lester, for this lecture. I was actually thinking about your opinion on polyamory in this sense. So do you see polyamory as going in the direction of disrupting public-private dichotomy? And if so, how do you see kind of a possible direction for the expression of desire? It's a little bit a follow-up question after one of our students questioned about intimacy. So not only the cultural framework that makes up our idea of intimacy, but what do you make of the very existence and prominence a little bit in our life of intimacy that also comes from this idea of public-private dichotomy, which of course feminists have been questioning already. But how do you see polyamory? So do you see it as a way to overcome this dichotomy, maybe using some other categories? And if so, do you see kind of the expression of desire that usually needs simulation and performance? If you even think about BDSM. So requiring a performance, you need some sort of even simulation of a stage. So in this sense, you need some sort of separation between public and private. So how do you see polyamory if it has a sort of potential to reinvent what we mean by public and private?
That's really interesting. Here's my thought on that is that, as you noted, this distinction can be problematized, right? It's a personal is political, right? So I could imagine, from people that I've talked to would note that monogamy is also part of politics. Like it's all public and private at the same time. And so I don't know that I would say monogamy is different than that, except for they put the politics a little bit more explicit. But there's politics in monogamy also. It's just not, usually put front and center as part of what the point is. Well, although in the whole family values narrative, it is, right? So yeah, I don't know that it's disrupting that. I would say except for bringing it more into focus that, these things are connected and that people can deliberately engage in intimate practices with, this intention of bringing about public change. But yeah, I don't know that it's that different from monogamy in that sense.
I think there's a couple of questions from the chat, and maybe then we can wrap up. So how do you feel that those in political power now in the US impact polyamorous practices? What it motivate more as a political response? Will backlash of the current political power impede it?
Yeah. I think it will make, well, it is making a lot of people a lot more nervous and a lot more cautious about what is publicly available about them. So yes, I do think that has, they're so far polyamory is not, one of these categories that's been kind of erased from websites and things like that. But a lot of the practitioners fall into those categories. So I think it will make people a lot more worried as in terms of what it will actually do as far as the everyday practice. I don't know yet. That's going to be something that's interesting to follow going forward about how these changes in the political landscape affect how people are experiencing what they're doing. Yeah.
So I'm thinking of other governments like capitalism that's crumbled into fascism, and you don't see a rise in polyamory, right? Thinking about like non-hyper individual societies where there's already a support system, we don't need that.
Right.
And so I'm wondering, like, if the US with its hyper individualism and like the high levels of anxiety are just kind of manifesting in polyamory, and we'll see if it's sustainable or not.
Yeah, that's
We're trying to recreate something that exists elsewhere for care and intimacy and support.
Yeah, I think you're spot on, and especially as our kind of social structures that try to provide some of that are kind of going away, that there may be even more of that. We need to rely on each other.
Like there's talk of mutual aid.
Right.
Why don't you, live here? Why don't we have sex? Why don't
Right.
we, whatever.
Right. Yeah.
Have a more open, honest relationship.
Exactly. We have time for more? Yes, sir, in the back.
First, thank you. And I really enjoyed the NC brave to challenge things like jealousy and the personal growth aspect of it. But in the back of my mind, I was thinking of, well, where did the little boo-boos come in?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that part.
Kids, children.
Yeah.
And that is going to affect them. And there's a lot more intricacies going on, and the butterfly effect. Yeah, it's great that you're personal growthing and all that, but you don't want to F up the kids.
Like instability, kind of? How does that affect kids?
Like what?
Like instability, is that kind of what you're saying? How does it
Yeah. I mean, you have no idea how all of that interaction is going to be taken by them and what they take. They pick up a hell of a lot of stuff.
So could it have their future relationships, kind of?
Yeah. I mean, just the whole straight. Yeah, I mean, there's a bazillion things in there that.
Yeah, there's a sociologist named Elizabeth Sheff who has done research on particularly this question, and she did, a kind of longitudinal study of children who were raised in polyamorous homes. And she was looking at their school performance, their emotional adjustment, kind of their relationship patterns as they got older, how they, all of this kind of stuff. And it's interesting because she found that polyamorous kids were actually more well-adjusted than other children. Now that, for me, begs the question of, there's other things going on in a family besides polyamory, right? It's like, what kind of resources do they have? What kind of, so there's those components that could also be part of what's going on. But at least she found that they weren't, adversely affected in the ways that we might imagine. So that's her finding. I'm sure there's a lot more work to be done in that area.
Then you can imagine, as a sociologist, a polyamorous household having 3 incomes.
Right.
Or having 2 incomes and childcare. And so I think when we look at like child outcomes, poverty and preventing poverty through economies of scale is such a huge factor that if we were able to do some sort of regression model or something, I think that would have a lot in play here.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the additional emotional intelligence and intimacy that children can learn from people who are also doing their own growth work and communicating effectively and having sustainable multiple relationships that look different.
You were talking a lot about like the ways that polyamory and monogamy are sort of related to neoliberal economics and a lot of those like internalized values. And I was wondering, you talked a lot about like the concept of ownership, and I was wondering, just like across your work, did you come across like the concept of like debt? Because to me, a lot, when I hear the like, I am yours, you are mine, also implies some level of like indebtedness to each other. And I was wondering how, and if across your work, like there was some relation or language or descriptions of feelings of being like indebted to your partner in a certain way, you owe them something, like that kind of stuff that influences those like relationship dynamics?
Not that I've heard among the people that I've talked to. In fact, they would probably be very quick to say, this person doesn't owe me anything. If they are choosing to be with me, then that's great. And I'm super grateful for that, but they don't owe me anything because I don't have any claim to their intimacy or their sexuality. That's theirs. So I think they would respond that way.
I think to follow up on what you were saying to that question, in those relationships, a lot of times there is more of a talk of a relationship smorgasbord is kind of the term that they use. And so with that, there is more of a talk of what the need is and walking that need forward or backward. And so there's more of these like relationship check-ins in order to have more of that continual dialogue, so that way someone doesn't feel like there's a need that isn't being met, or that they can actively address that. Should we wrap up here, or is there another?
Yeah, we're
okay, well, thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you for your questions.